Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here as always with Dr. Tyler McNabb. And today we have a guest who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. Professor of philosophy at at the University of Texas, Houston, oh my goodness, at the University of Texas, philosopher Dr. Robert Koons specializes in logic, metaphysics, philosophy, religion, and another one of those names that if you've been on the philosophy scene for more than 5 minutes, you know our guest today. So without further ado, Dr. Koons, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's really an honor. How are you doing today, brother?
Very well, thanks. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you much for the invitation.
Thank you for coming along. Big fan of your work, of course. Question for you. I enjoyed the recent exchange that you had with Feser in reference to if Aristotelian metaphysics sort of is better suited or sits more comfortably with a more dynamic, an A theory presentism, more so than say like a B theory eternalism or whatnot. And so wanted to see, I get from my reading of Feser, what he's saying is something like you have real change, right? There's a real instance where this has never existed and then it comes into existence, right? And so the idea of moving and moving from potentiality to act and so forth is real genuine and real. And I don't think he makes the claim that it can't be real on B theory, but the idea is just kind of like it's easier or it's easier to explain, or it's sort of a better groundwork for making sense of this if you're like a presentist compared to if you're a B theorist. And so I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that to start it off.
Yeah, so I think it relies really heavily on McTaggart's sort of argument that on a B theory picture you don't have real change, right? That so again, we talked about the banana that we just talked about in this discussion, where you had a banana that's green now, right, and tomorrow it's going to be ripe and yellow. Right, so it's changing. Let's say from non-ripe to ripe. And McTaggart's objection to the B theory was that it treats the future yellow banana, right, as part of reality, just as much part of the reality as the ripe green banana, right? And so it looks as though the banana hasn't really changed. It's just that part of it is green and the other part, the future part, is yellow. McTaggart gives the example of a poker that's hot on one end and cold on the other end. And if it just, it's just sitting there, hot on one end, cold on the other end, no one would say it's changing from hot to cold. It's just different parts have different features, right? So that's the argument it relies on. And I'm really torn between the A theory and the B theory myself. I'm not a committed B theorist. So I respect that argument. I think that argument has some real force. But the question that I was addressing, I was trying to address a somewhat narrower question, which is, if you're an Aristotelian, does that give that McTaggart argument or other arguments more force? Does that give you additional reason to reject the B theory and become an A theorist? And that, as far as I can tell, Ed did not give me any reason for thinking that, right? In his response to me, he just went back to the McTaggart argument and said, look, that's not real change if you're a B theorist. I see the point of it. I don't think that's a compelling argument. I don't think it's a decisive argument. But on the other hand, I see McTaggart's point, right? I feel some force to it. I just don't see how adding, let's see, Aristotle's machinery of actuality and potentiality, how that makes the McTaggart argument more persuasive, right? So I was saying, look, you could have a dynamic B theory in which you take on board potentiality and actuality, right? And you say, yes, change is the actualization of potential qua potential. I'm on board with that, absolutely right. So the banana right now has the potentiality to become ripe. And in the future, that potentiality is what's actualized, and that's why it changes. I totally agree with that whole story. And then Ed comes back and says, well, but that's not really actualizing any potentiality, right? Because you don't have this dynamic sense of time. Yeah, but I don't think that's added anything to the balance of arguments, right? That's just the standard atheoretic, objection. So I think that I didn't find that very persuasive. And the other thing that, well, I think a mistake that Ed tends to make, frankly, is to confuse what is absolutely true, or a property that's held absolutely by something, with something that's real or mind independent or objective or whatever. Or to turn it around, he tends to confuse relative properties or facts with subjective, mind dependent, unreal, fictitious sorts of facts, right? So, so you're in Macau right now, right, Tyler? So I don't know how many thousand miles that is, or 3,000 miles or something from me. So, so there's a relative property there, right, that you have of being 3,000 miles from me, let's say. Right? Now, there's nothing mind dependent or subjective or fictional about that relative property, right? It's just a relation. And so in a similar way, I want to say that the banana has the property of being potentially ripe, but it has that property in relation to particular times like now. And it won't have that property in relationship to it doesn't have that property in relationship to tomorrow, when it's no longer just potentially ripe, but actually ripe. And I think Ed tends to think, well, you're just making the change subjective now, or mind dependent or something. But I don't think that follows. I'm just saying that the potentialities that a thing has, it has relative to times. So it has different potentialities at different times. And that doesn't seem to me, a radical view, right? Or one that would be really incompatible with Aristotle in a broader sense. Now, there is one point at which I think Aristotle reveals himself not to be a B theorist, and that's in De Interpretatione, when he says that there's not even a truth value now as to whether the naval battle will be held tomorrow, let's say, if it's really potential. But there, it seems to me, Christian Aristotelians can't go along with that, I don't think, because at least not if you embrace what I call total omniscience. That is, God knows the future in detail, including all of the merely potential aspects of it, right? So God knows now, or eternally, let's say, whether the naval battle will be held, right? And so there's a truth about the future. Right. So here again, I think Ed misunderstood my objection. So he thought that he thinks that sort of objection depends upon a particular view about how God knows the future, that he knows it by something like observation, as opposed to knowing it by being the cause of the future events. But I don't think that's right. I think, because I agree with him completely about how God knows the future. There's no disagreement there. But the point is that if God knows the future, then there are truths about the future for him to know, right? So knowledge implies truth, right? And then the crucial point is, I was arguing in my paper, truth supervenes on being. That is, if there are things that are true, that has to be grounded somehow in things that exist, that are part of reality in some sense. And that's, of course, what Ed has to reject, because he wants to say there are truths about the future, which God knows, but those truths have no anchor in reality, so to speak. There's nothing about reality that says that the battle will or will not be held, right? Because it's merely potential at this point. And as an atheist or a presentist, he can't posit some kind of future fact out there that God knows. And I argued in my initial paper, that Aristotelians should be sympathetic to this truth supervenes on being idea. That, for instance, if you think about accidents, in Aristotle. I mean, why does he reify things like Socrates' musicality or Socrates' paleness? Why does he think of those as things? Well, because it's true that Socrates is pale, right? And it's true that Socrates is musical. And those truths ought to be grounded somehow in something in reality. And so Aristotle posits these accidents. So it's the existence of Socrates' musicality that makes it true that Socrates is musical. And in a similar way, it seems to me it's got to be this very plausible thing, there's the existence of something in the future that makes it true that the naval battle will be held, right? And so I think there's a very natural Aristotelian motivation for going at that point towards the B theory, actually.
So I'd like to ask you a question I wasn't planning on asking you, but it came to my mind when you mentioned that perhaps classical theists or Christians might have particular reason to affirm one theory over the other. As a Catholic, how are we to understand the Eucharist and what happens, the sort of the metaphysics of the Eucharist, if you're a presentist? Do you have any?
So your question is whether that relates to the metaphysics of time in some way,
right? So perhaps it might erase presentism. Maybe it allows growing blockism or something like that. If the idea is God being outside of time somehow, connects something on the timeline to what's going on presently. So on eternalism or growing blockism, this makes sense, but maybe on a strict old-fashioned presentism, maybe it might make lack the resources to make sense of this, and so this might propel one to either endorse growing blockism or eternalism, something like that.
Okay, so again, I think I'm missing something. So
okay.
So there's so God's being outside of time, right?
Yes.
I think that does suggest at least a kind of B theory. I'm not sure if I see the connection between that and the Eucharist. Is that what you said originally?
So the idea of the Calvary and sort of like connecting the point of Calvary to the sacrifice of the Mass, and
I see.
and
right.
and that's it's seeming easier to do if the past is ontologically real than yeah.
Oh yeah, good. No, I hadn't really thought of that. So I don't have much to say.
Okay.
I have to reflect on that some.
It's a question I've been thinking about too. So I was just like, oh, maybe he knows.
Yeah. I mean, any kind of picture in which it requires God to be outside of time, that I think fits comfortably with the B theory kind of picture, right? Because you get that from Boethius, actually. He's the first one, I think, to see that. But on the other hand, I mean, you could be an atheist and think that, I think.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, very good. What about like Aristotelian in general? So there's a revival going on to some degree, at least, in analytic circles, which is really cool. That more and more people are sort of coming to different sorts of Aristotelian views. Aristotelian metaphysics, sort of more generally speaking, what's sort of like the best objection that you're aware of that might put Aristotelian metaphysics in some trouble, and then how would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I mean, in general, there's a lot of moving parts in the Aristotelian picture of the world. It's as metaphysical theories go, it's relatively complicated, right? And so that's probably the most cogent objection, right? Just, do I really need all that stuff? I need form and matter, actuality, potentiality, substances, accidents, yada, 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 right? I mean, David Lewis's picture, or the picture of a kind of strict materialist, or even a substance dualist like Swinburne, you might think, oh, that's just a simpler picture of the world, and not really as complicated. So I think that's the one I probably worry about the most, is that I feel as an Aristotelian, there's a real burden of proof here to explain why these different parts are actually needed. And it's not easy. It takes time to kind of build up the case for all of the different aspects of it. The other objection I think that I take seriously is the sort of scientific objection that look, the scientific revolution just made Aristotle obsolete. And in particular, the idea that there are composite things that are substances in Aristotle's sense, that are actually fundamentally real, and the parts are somehow dependent on the whole, that would seem to be swimming against the stream of the the revolution and the central place that things like atoms and particles have had in the last 300 years. So this is why in the last few years I've been spending a lot of time on looking at Aristotle in relationship, in particular, to quantum theory. So I think that that's an area where science has actually shifted sides to some extent, and there's new arguments, new evidence for an Aristotelian sort of holism at the level of substances that. I think a lot of people in the sciences and in the philosophy of science haven't fully appreciated yet. There's been some movement in that direction.
Yeah, I think you talk about how entanglement's kind of evidence of this, and how looking at two different parts by themselves, right, doesn't tell the whole story. And so we need this more holistic picture, which fits more comfortably with Aristotelian metaphysics. Can you talk a little bit about that for a second?
Yeah, so especially in some of my earlier papers, I emphasize that. And I think now looking back, I'd say that's maybe one of the weaker points that I have made.
Okay.
But I mean, I think there's still some point to it, which is that, yes, it seems to be suggesting that that you don't have tiny autonomous things that make up the world. So and that was the picture that we got from Descartes and Locke and eventually Boyle and Maxwell and so on. So that sort of classical picture did seem to suggest that there are little bits of autonomous matter out there, and they move according to laws of nature, and everything else is just kind of a detail, right? It's just kind of unfolding of that basic reality. And already, I think the entanglement points to the fact that these little bits are not autonomous; that they're part always of a larger whole. But I think that what I would now emphasize is the fact that quantum mechanics is a theory about the very small, about the microscopic world, that on its face says the microscopic, or this world that we're studying, does not exhaust reality. By its very nature, it points to something beyond the microscopic, so to speak. And that's because, that the quantum theory is a theory about the evolution of probabilities, really. That's what the Schrodinger equation is all about, is how probabilities evolve over time in a very precise way. But probabilities of what, right? Well, probabilities of measurements of certain kinds. And measurements are things that, at least initially, cannot be described in quantum mechanical terms. So in other words, well, what terms are they described in? Well, this is an interesting question, but in practice, and Bohr, I think, saw this very clearly, and this is what is called now the Copenhagen interpretation, that quantum mechanics tells us that there are certain probabilities of observations or measurements taking place, where a measurement is something that involves substances, macroscopic, mesoscopic substances that are devices, our measurement devices, or our measurement machines that we set up in the laboratory. And they interact with these quantum phenomena in certain ways and producing results. And those are the measurements, right? But those cannot be characterized in quantum mechanical terms, but in other terms. Those are described in terms of chemistry, thermodynamics, solid state physics, other things. So it actually fits very nicely with an Aristotelian picture. Another way to think about this is, to get a complete theory of the world, you have to add something to the pure quantum theory. Right? As I say, it sort of screams, I'm incomplete. Right? And all the different interpretations actually add something. Right? So, the Neumann-Wigner view, adds minds is the thing that solves the problem. Well, I think and sometimes that's confused with Copenhagen, as though what Copenhagen does, or what Bohr does, is it gives the subjective observer some kind of special place. That's actually wrong. And I think Bohr is right here, that when you look at how science is actually practiced, the physicist does not worry about what's going on inside his mind. Right? He's worried about the instruments he's set up and what's kind of result they register. Right? And so it's not really a subjective process in that sense. So I think that was a mistake. There are other interpretations like Bohm's interpretation and GRW and others, and they all sort of explicitly add new structure to quantum mechanics in order to give us something closer to the old world where it's atoms in the void, right? So you get definite particles in definite places at different times, or you get a kind of collapse of these waves into something like the old Newton-Maxwell picture of a physical object. But again, those are really speculative, and they don't cohere well with actual scientific practice in the way that Copenhagen does. So what I and people like William Simpson, my colleague who's at Cambridge, have been arguing is that really we should take the Bohr picture and understand it in Aristotelian terms. That measurements involve substances, which are these fundamental composite things. And these substances have, again, chemical, thermodynamic, solid state physical properties that are strongly emergent, that are not reducible to the quantum mechanical properties. And so what we're doing is we're actually getting substances to interact with each other in quantum mechanical ways, right? So the quantum mechanical stuff is always dependent upon these Aristotelian substances. So my current view is that particles are only accidents of substances, and so they aren't. Substances are not in any sense composed of particles. Rather, particles are powers, in a sense, that a substance has to interact with other substances in certain ways. And I think that actually fits the actual practice of quantum mechanics much better than views that are often out there.
Yeah, very interesting. What about, we're talking about quantum mechanics. There's a typical objection that you might hear, standard sort of objection against sort of an Aristotelian view, or just PSR more generally, right? Where the idea is that quantum mechanics points to there being particles that come in and out of the quantum vacuum for, no reason, or random, that sort of thing. And so I know some theists have suggested that the quantum vacuum is the cause, right? Or some people point to deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics and just say it's all epistemic. It seems like it's sort of being uncaused, so to speak, but actually it's just our observation being incomplete. Do you have a particular response that you favor? Maybe one of those, maybe both, maybe something else?
Yeah, so I guess closer to the first one. I think first thing we have to do is get really clear about the relationship between causation and determinism. So I really going back to Elizabeth Anscombe's paper on causality and determination, back in her lecture actually in the late 50s, where she argued that our common sense notion of causation was never deterministic. In fact, we can clearly pry those two apart. And of course, especially in thinking about things like free will, or what Aristotle, I think, called rational powers. Those are pretty clear cases where you have causation without determinism, right? So I'm free to eat a donut or a croissant, right? They both have their value. I decide to eat the croissant. Is that an uncaused event? No, it was caused by me. I exercised a certain power, but I exercised that power in an indeterministic way because it was a rational power that was open to multiple possibilities. Now, I think it is true that for Aristotle, and for those who followed him, including Aquinas, they assumed that was limited to rational beings, that only rational beings have powers like that, and that the natural world is sort of deterministic. That is, each natural thing has a set of natural powers that are always determined to a particular end. And unless something interferes with them, they will always act in a very consistent way. So if there were no rational beings around, then you'd be able to check on how much interference there is, and you could just immediately predict exactly how the world is going to unfold through these natural powers. So I think what quantum mechanics has taught us, the way I understand it, is it's shown that the inanimate world is more like rational substances than we thought, that the natural powers, some of these natural powers at least, are indeterministic in much the same way that free will is indeterministic. So there's always a cause, in fact, but there isn't always a deterministic cause, so to speak, a cause that predicts with 100% probability that a certain result will happen. So in the case of the quantum vacuum in particular, I mean, this is another sort of interesting fact, I think, is that one of the things that quantum mechanics has taught us is that substances are less localized, I think, than Aristotle understood them to be. So when a substance emits light and electrons and other things into space, those are actually still accidents of that substance. So the substance in its accidental attributes is sort of spreading out into space. So there is, in fact, no such thing as a true vacuum, according to quantum mechanics, which is good for Aristotle, because there are no vacuums in Aristotle's picture either. So what we call a vacuum is actually the sort of emanation of multiple substances in the world, right? And where you have a particle emerging from that quantum vacuum, it's actually the potentiality of a particular substance that's being exercised according to these quantum mechanical laws. So it's an indeterministic result, but it is caused. It's always caused by a pre-existing accident of a substance of some kind. And there's something, in fact, there's always going to be something interacting with that substance in order to bring about this emergence of this quantum event, quantum particle. So it has a cause, but it's not deterministic. And there was another point I was going to make that occurred to me there. Oh yeah, there are other things that you could point to too, as far as the non-locality of substance. Although I think that certainly would have been news to Aristotle. There are aspects of Aristotle's natural philosophy that are sort of precedents for it. So it's not completely unprecedented in Aristotle's view. In fact, Aristotle's view of light is something like what I described, I think. So the sun actualizes the medium for Aristotle, enlightening the medium, let's say, between it and the earth, and thereby illuminating things on the earth. And that actualization of that medium is itself an accident of the sun. It's actually the action of the sun. So the sun is not completely localized up there. In fact, it's in respect of its accidents of action, it's spread out through space. And that's exactly the kind of picture that quantum mechanics suggests.
Oh, very good. Thank you. That was fantastic. I'll go ahead now and throw the ball to Mike and see what his questions are for you.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I'm curious, Dr. Koons, I want to go back to what you and Tyler were talking about before, and maybe talk about it more directly as it relates to your view. I know back in 2018, you wrote a fantastic paper that I came across in my philosophy of science class, where you argue that you push back against this physicalist interpretation of, that reality can be reduced down to the quantum world. And you push back against that, and basically you argue for an Aristotelian interpretation of quantum thermodynamics and chemistry, what you call a hylomorphic escalation. So I was wondering, it's such a great paper. I was wondering if you could sort of lay out some of the details of that view. I know you guys already touched on it a little bit, but maybe some of the specifics of your view there.
No, yeah, I'd be happy to. So I actually have a couple of additional papers. There's a paper that came out in Synthèse last year, I think it was, which followed up the paper that you're talking about. And there's another one that's forthcoming in the European Journal of Philosophy of Science. And again, I'd be happy to send you a copy of that. So it's an ongoing project. I mentioned William Simpson earlier. He just got his PhD in the DPhil in the Philosophy of Science program in Cambridge. And so he and I are really collaborating on a lot of this now. And we've been reaching out recently to George Ellis, who's a very famous physicist, cosmologist, and Barbara Drossel, who's been working with him, because we think their conception of contextual emergence, they call it, is actually very close to the Aristotelian picture. So we're going to try to get kind of fill some of those metaphysical holes in their approach, and I think again that'd be fruitful collaboration that we're working on. But one thing that I haven't talked about yet that I maybe should mention here is the importance of quantum chemistry and quantum thermodynamics in particular. So again, people think that quantum mechanics actually has reduced all this to the microscopic, to particle physics. If you read like Brian McLaughlin's really good paper on British emergentism, he says, well, it's a great idea, but quantum mechanics came along and showed us that we can completely explain what's going on with the water molecule using, quantum mechanics of electrons and protons. So, wrong, let's move on. Well, actually, McLaughlin turns out to be wrong. We can't, in fact, explain the properties of water from the bottom up. And there's a really strong consensus among philosophers of chemistry and of thermodynamics that this is the case, because to put it really simply, the quantum mechanical machinery, the equations, are completely symmetrical in space. And so if you feed in, well, we've got so many electrons, so many protons, so many neutrons, it always gives back, well, there's this completely uniform cloud, which is the same in every direction. And that is not a water molecule, right? Because we know the water molecule is very asymmetric in space. And so how do you get from a symmetrical foundation to an asymmetrical superstructure? Well, I argue it's got to be form that does it. There's got to be a top-down rather than a bottom-up factor. And again, I think this is pretty widely accepted. This also shows up in an interesting way. So when people use quantum theory in order to understand things like thermodynamics or chemistry, what they have to do is they have to go to a certain limit, which is their mathematical model has to act as if there were an infinite number of really tiny molecules in the space, instead of the finite number that you might think. And it turns out that if you don't go to that limit, you can't escape the trap of total symmetry. You can't solve the kind of problem that we're talking about. You can't explain chemical structure. You can't explain the phase transitions between solid and liquid and solid and so on. In order to even be able to talk about those things, you have to use a model that is strange in the sense that it models reality as if there were an infinite number of smaller particles. So what I take that to mean is that these models are, the fact that we're using these models is a signal, it's a sign that we're dealing with something ontologically novel here, right? Because if these molecules were nothing but heaps of particles, then a finite model that has just the right number of particles should do just fine. It should be able to represent all the structure and all the properties that we need. And the fact that we know that it can't, something called the Stone-Neumann theorem, we know that it can't. And so that indicates that that we can know there's something going on here in chemistry and in thermodynamics that is not merely particles moving around in space. There's got to be something else. There's got to be something that's structuring them in space in such a way that you get these asymmetric kinds of phenomena. So this is an idea that actually was made clear already by Hans Primus, a philosophical chemist in the late 20th century, and Jeffrey Sewell and others have been writing about this as well. So, and of course, the materialist is going to push back. I'm going to try to say that these models are merely useful fictions, but it's not a useful fiction in the same way that, say, if I model a ball moving on a ramp in a frictionless model, okay, that's just simplifying things, right? I'm just eliminating things that would otherwise complicate the story. That's not what's going on here. Because the finite model doesn't have the kind of structure that's needed to even describe the phenomena correctly. And so that suggests that this distinction between infinite and finite models reflects a real ontological difference, the role that form is playing in this picture.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And of course, there are lots of reasons too, thinking that particles are not the fundamental reality, right? So it turns out, for instance, that even the number of particles that a particular thing is composed of is something that is indefinite, that has, again, a sort of range of probability values associated with it. And so the particles really are just accidents of the substance. They're ways in which the substance is inclined to express itself in different circumstances.
Yeah, incredibly interesting. This was one of those papers that I had to read 5 times to get 10% of it, but each time I'm like, this is so good, and I don't even understand it, but I know it's good. So no, that was great. Thank you for that. And I guess kind of a follow-up question. Are there, and I think you were touching this on at the end, are there any sort of greater metaphysical implications, specifically as it relates to theism? Is there anything we can draw from this as theists? From this picture of the quantum world and how it, in this hylomorphic interpretation, this top-down interpretation?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think there probably is, although this is an area I need to do a lot more thinking about myself, actually. I mean, it does seem to me that a world in which there are things like fundamental biological forms, fundamental anthropological forms, let's say, that points to the need for an intelligent creator, I think, in a way that a Democritean world of particles in the void didn't, right? I mean, I don't know if I can make that a rigorous argument, but it just seems to be really implausible that a world of this kind would emerge without any kind of intelligent direction, right? And it's not, we can't now just say, well, evolution explains everything, because evolution won't help, right? Evolution will just get the particles moving around the right sort of way, but where does the form come from? You need the form, right? The human form, the biological form, the living form, in order to get real organisms. And that seems to me to point to a creator in some sense. The other thing I think that you could argue is that it sets things up for the fifth way. Aquinas somewhat better, because if things have forms, and those forms have powers, causal powers, and those causal powers then point that thing to definite ends or results, right? Which will be the result that will happen if those powers express themselves correctly, right? So then you get teleology basically in the world for free, right? It's not, you don't have to add it in, it just comes naturally from the story. And then once you've got teleology, then you can run the fifth way and say, well, but how could an inanimate object be ordered to these definite ends, or an unintelligent organism ordered to this very sophisticated sort of end without the aid of a mind behind it? So I think it does support the fifth way.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. Real quick before we let you go, we'll kind of bank a hard right here and give our listeners some whiplash. But I'm curious, you and Tyler had done a podcast recently where you argued for Roman Catholicism, or gave your reasons for believing that Roman Catholicism is true. And so for somebody on the outside, I'm curious, what do you find to be the single most compelling argument for the truth of Roman Catholicism?
Yeah, so I've got a book coming out later this year called A Lutheran's Case for Roman Catholicism. So because I actually wrote the manuscript as a Lutheran, so it's literally true, the title. While I was writing it, I was a Lutheran, and was thinking about Catholicism, and in fact I started writing the book with the hope that this would exercise Catholicism in my mind, that I would, once I got all the arguments out there, I'd be able to tear them apart, and then I could stay Lutheran. But as it turned out, once I got them out there, I found it really convincing and couldn't gainsay them. So there's really a couple things I could say. I mean, one is one thing I was impressed on very early on is the fact that a kind of sola scriptura picture doesn't make sense for several reasons, just logically doesn't make much sense. So if you try to base all your theology in the Bible alone, you've got two problems. One is the Bible never says you should base all your theology in the Bible alone. So there's a conflict there. And the other one is that there's no divinely inspired table of contents in the Bible, right? There's no book of contents, which tells you exactly which books are to be included. And so it looks like you have to rely on something outside the Bible in order to have a theology. That's the first one. And then, as I say, this book is mostly about the problem of justification, because that was the real sticking point for me as a Lutheran. How is it that we get right with God? And I had the impression that Catholics thought that really you got right with God by becoming righteous yourself, and that God would help you some along the way in various ways, but still it's basically do it yourself kind of task, right? And so coming to see that that's an inaccurate picture of Catholic theology, and that the good works that we do, insofar as we could say that they merit salvation, which we do say that, they merit them because they are manifestations of Christ's life in us, right? So it's not that I autonomously become righteous enough that merit salvation. It's rather that by being connected through the sacraments with Christ, he manifests himself in my life through his grace, and those acts merit salvation, right? For his sake, not because I'm some autonomously righteous thing. So that kind of understanding helped me make that last step.
So would it be fair to say? Sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Tyler. Go ahead. You're good.
I was just going to say, would it be fair to say that the sort of approach that you took was, answering sort of objections that you initially had that sort of justified your view of being a Protestant or a Lutheran specifically, and then once you realized that those objections weren't very good, it kind of just led you to become a Catholic? So you thought you had kind of the burden of proof to protest the church, and then once you realized that there was nothing to protest, it's like, well, okay.
Yeah, that expresses it pretty well. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's because of the worries I had about sola scriptura early on, that made me realize that, well, you have to be part of a kind of living tradition of some kind.
Right.
And so then if I'm going to say, well, that living tradition went off the rails at some point, and we Lutherans have revived it, then there's a burden of proof, I think, on the reformer to make that case. And in the end, I felt that they couldn't make that case. In fact, it turned out it seemed to me clear that Paul's teaching about justification is actually closer to the Council of Trent than to the Lutheran position in the end. But if I'd reached the point where I decided it was a draw, I still probably would have become a Catholic, just because, again, the burden of proof, I think, is on the one who's breaking with tradition in some obvious sense. I mean, the thing that started this whole thing for me was, I guess, 40 years ago when I was an undergraduate, and some friends and I got together and started reading some of the early church fathers. And I expected them to sound like Lutherans, basically, at that point, and I was really shocked when they sounded awfully Catholic. So that's the thing that kind of got the ball rolling.
I've had the exact same experience.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah, because, when I was growing up as a Lutheran, we didn't have this story that, the faith was lost when the apostles died and then somehow Luther recovered it. No, Luther was just reforming the church, that had gone astray somewhere in the late Middle Ages or something,
Yeah.
right? So I thought, well, get past that, get back to Augustine, get back to these earlier guys. It'll sound very Lutheran, but it didn't. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. Dr. Koons, thank you so much for your time today. We're incredibly grateful for your work. And again, we really appreciate you coming on the show today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.